Throughout history, there have been many wars. We've always had kings fighting kings, whether it be for resources, sometimes for love, or even just for pure domination. Some people just want to rule the world. Now, most of these battles are long forgotten, never to be talked about again, but some remain and gain an almost myth-like status in the world. If you've seen the movie 300, then you'll be a little familiar with this video. We're talking about the Battle of Thermopylae, in which 300 Spartans stood strong and defended their position for 3 days against a massive Persian army of over 100,000. Sound too good to be true? Well, stick around. Welcome to Vlogs of Knowledge. I think we've all heard of the Greeks fighting the Persians, or the Persians invading Greece, like it's a popular topic. But one has to ask a few questions. For one, well, how did it actually go down? What really happened? Is it really as intense as people make it out to be, as the movie makes it out to be? And more importantly, did it really happen? Because you know, when people tell stories, they tend to exaggerate the facts a little bit. I think it's human nature. We all want to tell a good story and we all want to get a good reaction out of the other person. And sometimes to get that reaction, we sacrifice the integrity of the facts. But don't worry, all of these questions that I mentioned before, we're gonna answer in this video. But first, as you all know, I always like to put this in historical context and get some background. All of this happened in the 5th century BC, and since civilization came to be, there have been numerous empires that rose and fell. At the time, it was the time of the Persian Empire. It was the biggest empire the world had ever seen. It covered all of Western Asia all the way up to Egypt. Like, it was just massive for its time. As an empire, you usually want to expand as much as possible. If it's not your ego driving you, then it has to be for resources. Conquering can be very profitable. I mean, just think about it. You show up someplace, you have the better army, you take the man, you take the woman, and you take the treasures, you can do whatever you want. Who's going to stop you? Now, Greece wasn't really that rich. They didn't have that many resources. It's really unsure as to why the Persians chose to invade it. But they did. And this is what we call the Persian invasions of Greece. And I say invasions because there were two, and we're going to cover both of them because they're both pertinent to the story. In the year 492 BC, there was a great, magnificent, and beautiful king of Persia called Darius I. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating because him and I share the same name, and if he's magnificent, that means I'm magnificent too. But in all seriousness, he was a good king and he really wanted Greece. He wanted to take it over and make it part of his empire. Before launching a full-on invasion, he at least had the courtesy of giving them a warning. He sent messengers to the Greek city-states asking them to surrender without a fight. And remember, this was before countries and all of that. Now, as a Greek city-state, you kind of had no choice but to accept, right? Like, if you said no, well, are you sure? Because we've got like the biggest army, we could totally destroy you. Like, just think about it. Almost all of the Greek city-states accepted except two, Athens and Sparta. And I guess they really were sure of themselves because they did more than just refuse. They killed the messengers. Like, okay. Darius was now enraged. He had built a massive army and was coming straight for Greece. The army marched all the way up to Greece and destroyed many cities in the process. Eventually, they were met with the Greek forces. Now, the Greeks, they were better equipped and better trained, so even though they were outnumbered, they managed to win. They drove the Persians out of Greece and back into Asia. This was the first Persian invasion of Greece. Darius wasn't done. Like, how could he be, right? He failed. This was a humiliation. He had the bigger army and he failed to invade Greece. But unfortunately, he died before he could come up with a second army. The empire then went to his son Xerxes, and honestly, that's such a better name than my name. Like, I wish I was named like that. Like, just think about it in today's terms. Hi, my name is Xerxes. I'm here for the job interview and possibly invade your country. Nice to meet you. The new king of Persia wanted to complete what his father had started, but this time he gave them no warning. He just got a big army, the biggest one the world had ever seen, and headed straight for Greece in 482, 10 years after the events of the first invasion. Some accounts really exaggerate the size of his armies. Perhaps you've heard the term 1 million. Now, 1 million is a bit too much. Realistically, it was more like 100,000. But still, 100,000 men for an army, that was huge, especially back then. Like, the world population was nowhere near what we have today. I guess they really wanted Greece. Crossing into Greece proved to be a little difficult. Greece has a lot of mountains, and mountains, as you all know, are hard to climb, especially with such a big army. Like, just think of all the horses that were required for that army. Like, they had no choice but to bring the horses by sea. But there was one place where they could pass, the Pass of Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a small place on the eastern coast of Greece. On one side you had the mountains and on the other side you had the coast, which made it very narrow, and that was good for the Greeks. Now think about this from a Greek perspective. You knew that the Persians were coming, right? They made that very clear. You also knew where they were going to come from. And you also knew that you had an advantage given the environment, like you had everything you wanted. But because of religious reasons, they only sent a very small army to Thermopylae. There was a festival going on in Greece in which you didn't really fight battles. But the reality of the situation was that the Persians were coming, they were invading, so you kinda had to defend yourself. The result was that they sent about 7,000 Greek men, and out of those 7,000 were the iconic 300 Spartans led by Leonidas. When the two armies met, the Persians chose not to attack for 4 days. The rationale was that, look, when the Greeks see our armies, they're not going to want to fight us. Like, who's going to want to fight such a big army? That way the Greeks will give up, we won't have to fight, and we won't have to lose any men. The Greeks were not going to back down, like they were very brave. They were going to stand their ground and await a Persian attack. Now on the 5th day, the Persians had enough waiting and they chose to attack. They were well known to use long range attacks like bows and arrows, and in the past that would have worked, but not against the Greeks. The Greeks had better armor, and with their phalanx formation, the arrows proved to be ineffective, so they had to resort to close combat. But the Greeks were professionally trained and they had the environmental advantage. All of Persia's armies could not fit in the narrow passage, which allowed the Greeks to defend with not too much difficulty. Now this would have been a great story if it wasn't for this one trader that wanted money from the Persians. He knew of a passage that could lead the Persians right behind the Greeks, and if that were to happen, the Greeks were to be attacked from both sides, like it would be pretty much game over. When Leonidas realized what was going on, he ordered his troops to retreat while there was still time. He remained with his 300 Spartans and about 1,000 other men defending the back. And this is really where we get the movie 300 from. That's where the 300 Spartans were defending themselves against the Persians. But this is reality. Like, what's 300 men against a massive army of over 100,000 that's attacking you from both sides? Like, they stood no chance. Leonidas was killed and his army followed shortly after, and Xerxes, he wanted his head to put it on a spike. I guess it was because he had proven to be such a difficult opponent, and perhaps the fact that his father had failed an invasion before him, he really wanted to show off the fact that he had finally won against the Greeks. The pass of Thermopylae was then left to the Persians, and they made their way to mainland Greece. But wait, guess what? Even though the battle doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, the story does. When the Persians eventually found the Greeks again, the Greeks were outnumbered, better equipped, and better trained. They won for the second time. They drove the Persians out of Greece and back into Asia. And bonus points, they went back to Thermopylae, they found Leonidas' body, and they brought it back to Greece. Like, that's insane. This battle, as real as it was, gained an almost myth-like status to the Greeks. Like, every single Greek person was talking about it. And Leonidas, he became almost like a god, still to be talked about millennia to come. Like, I'm still talking about him right now, aren't I? And that pretty much sums up the Battle of Thermopylae. What surprised you the most? Did you see the movie, and how does it compare? Please leave me a comment, I would love to know, and bonus points for you, you might get featured in next week's video as a fan of the week. I made this episode a little bit longer because I really wanted to make sure to cover the background in depth. Like, the battle itself, it was great, but it would be not that significant if it wasn't for the fact that the Persians had tried 10 years before to invade Greece and they failed, and this was their second time. Now, I haven't talked about everything, and the things that I did talk about, I haven't gone into too much detail. That's okay, that's done on purpose. I want you guys to go out and research on your own and maybe learn a thing or two. With that being said, my name has been Darius Coslin, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.